There we go. Okay. So Gwyn, maybe if you could just, Gwyn and Andrew, if you could just put it on mute for now, and that would be fine. So I'm not going to do a big, huge introduction of Tanya Bolduc, but for those of you who are involved with CASE, Tanya is our new communications coordinator, notre nouvelle coordonnatrice chez CASE des communications. Elle est là depuis un mois à Bûche. She's working so hard, and we're very lucky to have her. She's also a gardening enthusiast, and some of you who are on Facebook would have seen her photo of sort of an earth mother in her container gardening photo. And it's so great that she's here to do the presentation and share her information with us. So as I said, a presentation about, we'll go about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and you can interrupt if you have to. S'il vous plaît, interrompre avec vos questions ou écrire dans le chat. And after that, on va avoir de la place pour les questions. There'll be place for questions. I'll pass it over to you, Tanya, so that you can.
All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Let me go here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
All right, great. Here we go. All right. So thank you everybody for showing up. I'm pretty excited about this. And when Julie asked me, I want to give a presentation, I immediately jumped on container gardening, not just because I predominantly container garden, but I also feel like it's one of the ways that a lot of beginners start gardening. And there's a lot of information for container gardening, more than just sticking a plant or a seed in a pot. So I feel, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and in podcasts, people are often talking about container gardening versus conventional gardening. So I thought it would be a good one to start with. So I will get right into it. And just basically the agenda for today is we're going to look at why people container garden. We're going to look at why, what it is really outside of just being in a container, how it differs from other forms of gardening, what you can grow in containers, the types of containers, their pros and cons. I really want to do a good focus tonight on grow bags because I use a lot of grow bags, and there are a lot of reasons for that. They're a fairly new way of container gardening. Want to talk a bit about maximizing yield, space, and season extension. And I want to finish off with the two most important topics that come, into play when it's container gardening, which is watering and fertilization, because those are key to successfully container gardening. Also kind of key to successful container gardening indoors with houseplants, right? Which is just another form of container gardening inside. So the main reason people, excuse me, one of the main reasons people container garden is you have a small space. This is actually a photo from my balcony at my last residence in Gatineau, Quebec. I was on the 3rd floor, and all of the apartments in about a 5-acre area looked like this. These are condos, and it was a rented space. And all I had was about 5 feet by 7 feet to work with. Thankfully south facing, and a lot of people balcony garden, and you can see I used grow bags and plastic containers. So small space gardening is a big reason why people container garden. They just don't have anywhere else or any other method to garden. And because it was kind of a wind tunnel, sometimes my small space garden ended up making my apartment look really small because we'd get a big old storm. And one of the conveniences of having a container garden is if you really have to bring them in, you can. And I'm sure many of you have done this in the past. If you've ever encountered really bad weather, you've gone out and saved your plants. So that is my living room. You can also see here that's my indoor growing area. So my apartment kind of became a jungle of plants on a very frequent basis. Another reason that people container garden is they have space, but they don't have soil. That's my problem. I now live in a duplex that I rent. I live on the main floor. I have a beautiful backyard. I have a beautiful front yard. But even if it were my own, that soil is so compacted because it's basically construction rubble, and you cannot get a spade in there. So even if you did raise beds, you would not be able to access the soil underneath. Nothing except maybe some sunflowers would break through. So the soil itself can't be worked. Another reason is location. Where I live, for example, and this is, this is my driveway, right? The sunniest part of where I live is along my 6-car driveway. And this is the south facing wall. And it's really the only place I can grow tomatoes. And I am a huge, huge grower of tomatoes. I'm a bit crazy about tomatoes. So I have some lava rocks. Ugh, they're hideous, but they were fantastic for draining. So I set up grow bags. I have about 14 tomato plants that grow along this wall. And the location is good too, not just because it's south facing, but because that wall, because it's a light brick, also reflects light, which really, really helps with the tomatoes. It's an old technique, right? So location, sometimes the only location you have that has 8 hours of sun is not anywhere you could garden. So that's one reason that I garden in containers. And another one is you're not allowed. So I rent. I have a wonderful landlord who lets me, do whatever I want with the yard because as I'm clean and neat and I'm the crazy plant lady and people love it in my neighborhood. But I don't want to invest in building raised beds. I don't want to invest in perennial gardening as much as I would love to. I have renoviction hanging over my head all the time. So for me, container gardening is a way that I don't invest in permanent structures and permanent plantings, and I can take them with me if I really need to. One of the reasons people sometimes forget is that container gardening is great for accessibility. Even down here at the Sherbrooke Hospital, they have a nice raised garden that's wheelchair accessible for the residences. It's not the Sherbrooke Hospital anymore, it's the seniors residence. And so, for somebody who has back issues, who doesn't want to, bend over and do a lot of lifting, having raised containers is really wonderful, and they're particularly good for things like greens. One of the things I say, if you have something raised like this and you want to grow tomatoes, well, you better make them pretty deep, but they're fantastic for greens. And this is a realistic sort of garden that you can have with this kind of raised container. They're also not accessible to critters. Containers are a great way to keep rabbits out of your garden. Sometimes marmots, some marmots can climb. I know plenty of people who've gone to raised containers like this, table type containers, simply to keep the rabbits out of their lettuces and their strawberries. This is a slightly unrealistic photo. I mean, who's going to grow 3 cauliflower, tomatoes, broccoli, and all of that in here? So clearly a bad graphic design job. But I have seen rabbits literally like hunkering to go get at greens, and they can't get at it. They're terrible climbers. And another reason, beautifying. I mean, who doesn't love a beautiful window box or a beautiful hanging basket? They're great because they're nice outside, but they're also nice from when you're inside looking out. So your garden kind of comes inside, right, when you beautify it. And accenting things like a window, maybe a front porch, a corner of your yard, that just looks a little empty, or next to a bench. Accenting with containers is fantastic. It's a great way to add discussion pieces to your garden. And the other one is getting creative. And I sometimes spend hours looking at how people get creative with gardening, from moss terrariums to air plants to lawn ornaments that they salvage and repurpose. I like this one. It's a bird bath with some succulents inside, and which I think is hilarious because you think of something being really, really wet like a bird bath, but you've got succulents that are kind of iffy about wetness. So so that's another reason people container garden, just for fun, get creative. The main, how can I put this? I'll just explain it. There's so many ways to garden, right? I mean, the main way that people think of it. Oh, wait, sorry. Getting ahead of myself. What can you grow in containers? I guess you can grow pretty much anything. You can grow flowers, you can grow vegetables. By flowers, you can do annuals, you can do perennials. I've grown wildflowers in containers. Most vegetables can be grown in containers. You can grow small trees, usually dwarf trees. I've seen Japanese maples in really large containers. You can grow berries. There's a farmer, I believe, here in Quebec who grows all of his raspberries inside a greenhouse in containers. You can grow almost anything as long as that container provides enough space, nutrients, water, and air. So those are always the things that all plants need, whether they're in containers or not, right? Things that you can't or shouldn't grow in containers are most trees. Most trees need, their roots get too big. You're going to need an enormous container. That includes shrubs. And they also need a more interesting biodynamic environment to grow well. So even dwarf trees can be tricky to grow in containers because of that. Things that I would never recommend you grow in a container if you're into vegetables, into food growing, are corn and cereal crops. Corn's a really, really, really heavy feeder. Usually you plant corn about 18 inches from each other, and you need a lot of corn kind of hunkered together in order for them to pollinate. So you'd basically be throwing in nutrients and you probably wouldn't get an ear of corn. You could kind of grow it as a novelty, but don't expect to get corn out of it. And cereal crops like wheat and oats. I mean, technically you could grow it in a container, but why would you? I mean, you might do it as an experiment with your kids, but you're not really going to get anything out of it, except maybe chicken feed and not a whole lot. Large storage vegetables are things that I'm all into growing beets and carrots and rutabagas and even cabbages in containers. But be aware that, again, you're dealing with limited space. And if you want to have those big vegetables that you can store for the winter, it's probably not going to do well in a container. I usually recommend that you do baby beets and baby carrots and, maybe those Japanese turnips. Cabbages take up a lot of space. So, you can do it, but be aware that your success rate will be a lot lower and it's not an efficient use of container growing. And you shouldn't grow too much in a container. Don't crowd your plants. There are techniques where you can seed lots and lots of carrots, and you'll pick out little tiny carrots, and they're kind of fun and cute to serve at dinner time, and your kids will enjoy picking them out, and you can thin them out. But generally speaking, you don't want to overcrowd your containers. Plants need their roots to spread, and that includes in containers. How do containers differ from other forms of gardening? Well, our traditional form of gardening, which is in the ground, is my preferred method to garden. I really wish I had land. I spend probably 50% of my reading time learning about building good soil and talking to experts about it. And yet I never get to do it because I'm really into the soil food web. In-ground gardening takes advantage of that living soil, right? It's full of bacteria and fungi and protozoa and arthropods, and all of that makes this living, breathing environment that creates a symbiotic relationship with the plants, right? So, the plant makes sugars from sunlight, it shares those sugars with, the bacteria and stuff in the soil, and they in turn help provide nutrients to the plant, right? In a water-soluble format. The same is said for raised beds. I mean, a true raised bed has access to the soil food web, right? It's not contained completely within the barrier that you've created for it. It should be able to access the ground underneath and bring up nutrients, just like an in-ground garden. If it can't, like if I did a raised bed in my backyard, this would probably not happen. It would be a container garden. I would probably have to make it about 18 inches deep for it to work at all. And container gardening, outside of the fact that you're growing in a thing, doesn't have a soil food web. You are not gardening in a way that is using a biodynamic system to feed your plants and keep them healthy. It just isn't going to happen. You will get some bacteria in there, of course. You will get some fungi even, especially if you use Promix, which comes with like fungus. Fungus will find its way in there. And of course, you'll get little critters once in a while that'll come into your containers, but never in a way that will create a biodynamic system to help with that symbiotic relationship that most plants need. And this is why container gardening is considered, and this is not to throw people off, this is why container gardening is considered the hardest form of gardening, because it makes you think you're growing in soil, but you really aren't. You're not growing in a living system. And this is why you have to baby your plants. Literally think of container plants as infants. They are going to demand a lot more from you than your plants that are in your in-ground garden, or your plants that are in your raised bed, or even the plants that are in a hydroponic system, because hydroponics are kind of automated, right? You don't have to attend to them all the time. Container plants demand a lot more attention for feeding and watering and making sure that the plant has enough space to grow well. And I don't want this to discourage you, but I garden in containers mainly because I have to. If I didn't have to, I would go with another system and just have a few pots here and there. All right. So the more containers you have, the more attention you'll have to pay to your garden. You don't container garden in soil. What you're growing in is something they call potting soil, right? So potting soil, when you go to the garden center and you buy potting soil, the word soil is really misleading. It's basically a picture. Most potting soil is made up of peat, sometimes some coir or all coir, but most is peat, with some lime that balances it out, neutralizes it for pH. It has some sort of fertilizer mixed in and sometimes some wood chips, a bit of organic matter, but it's not a living thing. It doesn't have the living organisms in it to make it soil. So technically it should be called potting mix or potting medium. And sometimes it actually says potting mix or potting medium. And you have to fill it with that kind of growing medium because it's more light, it's more aerated, it's better draining than anything you would use like topsoil in your regular garden. Remember, the earth breathes, right? It's a living thing. Your soil is alive, it's breathing, it's moving, it's changing. That's not the case in your container. So you have to provide those ideal conditions right from the beginning. Roots have nowhere to go. So again, roots help make soil breathe, right? And in this case, you're not going to have the space to do that. And you need to be able to retain nutrients, moisture, and air. You're going to have to play artificial food web for your container plants. That's basically your job, is you're going to be providing everything to it that the soil food web would otherwise provide naturally. So that is the challenge of container gardening. But it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to throw you off. It's not as complicated as I'm making it sound. It's just, it's an important point. And that's why I put together this do and don't list, right? So this is a really important list for you to understand why people fail or succeed in container gardening. First, invest in a high quality potting mix or medium. Don't skimp. Don't get the stuff from the dollar store. Don't go for the cheap bags of potting mix for $1 a bag. You have no idea where that's coming from, and they're often filled with poor quality materials. I'm going to give a big plug out to Promix. Promix is a little bit more expensive but honestly, you will get more bang for your buck, and that stuff will last for years. You will be able to repurpose that stuff much better than you would a cheaper type of potting mix. When you're filling up your containers, yes, add compost. Add the right ratio of compost. I always say about 1/3 of what you put into your container should be a good quality compost, lots of nitrogen-rich compost for greens, and lots of shrimp compost for heavy feeders like tomatoes and cucumbers and berries, because it has added calcium to it, right? The shrimp shells have a lot of calcium, and those plants need a lot more calcium than, say, lettuces or peas. You can add vermiculite, that little, that little gold stuff that lightens up your soil, or the perlite, the little popcorny white stuff that looks like styrofoam. It's usually already in your potting mixer medium, but it doesn't hurt sometimes to add a little bit more. It's an option. And do please add a slow release fertilizer with lots of micronutrients. And most fertilizers are NPK. That's great. And as much as I love ProMix, all I see is NPK. I don't see any micronutrients. So calcium, magnesium, iron, boron, the bigger the list, the better. You can go with an organic fertilizer. There are plenty of great all-purpose vegetable, flowers, tomato specific fertilizers, but make sure they have calcium, magnesium, all of those micronutrients that are so important to the structure, and the vitamins and minerals for your plant is what they are. And a lot of fertilizers are surprisingly low on micronutrients. You cannot simply use compost. Compost is going to get eaten up so fast in your container that not having a slow release fertilizer, you will starve your plants. You can add additional calcium. Like I said, shrimp compost is great. Bone meal is fantastic. It quickly becomes available to the plant. I like to do this at planting time. And one of the biggest mistakes people make with container gardening is they don't mulch. If you garden in raised beds, or you do conventional gardening in rows right in the ground, you know the importance of mulch, not just for weeding, but also keeping water from splashing up onto your plants and spreading disease. You know that mulch like natural cedar and especially straw will reflect light up onto your plants. But even more so in containers, it will retain the water in your containers. Containers dry out really fast, much faster than any other form of gardening, and mulch makes an enormous difference. Before I started mulching my containers, because I was on a balcony, I lost water so fast. I was sometimes watering 3 times a day. The minute I started mulching, once a day usually did it, unless it got really hot. So I use a mixture of straw and cedar, natural cedar, because they get rid of flea beetles. And I despise flea beetles. I think we all do. Please don't use topsoil. Please don't use garden soil. Topsoil is just too heavy. It's too mineral based for a container. Garden soil is mostly clay and silt. It basically turns into rocks. Black earth, which is like the worst of the bottom of the peat bog or soil from your yard. I don't care how much perlite or compost you add to that, it just doesn't work in containers. It will turn into concrete. Don't add sand as a filler either, unless your plants really like sandy soil. It's okay to do that, but some people I know have added sand to their containers simply because they want to kind of save money on having to fill them. And it's not a great idea. And a lot of sand is questionable. It's not always good for your garden, like playground sand. And it's going to make it pretty overly drain. You don't really want most containers to drain too much. I have nothing against crushed eggshells. I really don't. I've used them for years. But my research has shown that eggshells take a really long time to break down. And they really do need that living system to help break them down from the soil food web. So if you're putting crushed eggshells, even from a grinder, like a coffee grinder into your pots, it's probably not going to become available as calcium to your plants. It's not going to hurt them, but you're not really going to get anything out of them, and you're better off putting them in your compost bin or your regular garden. And this one is going to be a controversy. I can't tell you how many arguments in podcasts and conversations. There's a habit of people adding lots of rocks and gravel to weigh down their pots and increase drainage. But the science on this, to me, is pretty conclusive. What rocks do is they increase the water table, which means you think it's draining, but it actually drains extremely slowly, and it will actually cause root rot. And I used to do this, and I used to have huge root rot problems, and then I figured it out. Oh, I don't need to put rocks in there, gravel in there, or sand in there. It also really significantly reduces the volume of your growing area, of your medium. My option is, if you have pots that blow over and you're worried about that, stick a couple of large stones in there instead of gravel. The stones won't stop it from draining, but rocks and gravel will. Any questions at this point? I thought maybe we could just stop for a second and see if there are any questions. Because this is a lot of information at once, but the whole part of like filling your containers is probably super duper important. One of the most important parts of container gardening is filling them with the right stuff. Does anyone have any questions?
You can either put up your hand in the reaction button or just sort of wave madly at the screen. And Gwen has a question.
Okay, so I'm with you, Tanya. It's really good to put the best potting soil you can in for the new year. But what I do is every time I empty the pots in the fall, I put the potting compost from that year into sacks, and I tend to put it in the bottom of big pots. What do you think?
That's fine, because actually the next part of this is whether or not we can repurpose potting mix. And I mean, when I started container gardening, again, because I had no other choice, the rule was you have to buy new potting mix every year. And this got really expensive and kind of annoying, because I had to throw out all of this stuff. And what I found was eventually we've changed our philosophy. You know, it's kind of like we all said we had to do double digging, and then we discovered no-till. Double digged again, right? So you can repurpose your potting mix. There's no reason why you can't. And what I say here is it's medium, it's not soil. You just add compost to it, right? You can add more perlite or vermiculite if you felt you needed to lighten it up. You could top it up with potting mix, again, just a little bit more, or coconut coir, which is cheap. I should stop here. There's a big sort of debate now whether or not we should be using potting mix at all, because it is peat based. Ecologically, we're all concerned about the peat bogs. My argument is that I feel really bad that I spent like $300 on good potting mix, but I don't see myself buying any more potting mix for several years, because I'm going to be repurposing it, right, by adding compost and vermiculite instead. And I'm not sure coconut coir is a much better option, because again, it comes from an industry, but it's got to be shipped and, you know, it's processed. So, you know, I say keep your footprint low, invest the first year, and repurpose, reuse.
Any more questions? Don't wave madly at the screen. Gwen has, hold on a sec, Gwen. Hold on. Marilyn's waving at the screen.
Marilyn.
Yes, Marilyn. I just, what I like to do in the bottom of my pots that I've done very well of is put in pine cones. Because then I can put them into the compost after, like I can dump my pot wherever, and I don't have to worry about anything. And so each year we have pine trees here on the farm, so I just pick them up every year. I never reuse the pine cones, but I always change
Okay.
them every year. But I find it's wonderful because they help absorb moisture and then put it back into the soil as it dries. And anyway, that's what I do, especially in big pots. Instead of using so much soil, I'll use a third of pine cones in the bottom.
And I'm a huge fan of pine needles for mulch as well. So if you have access, I'm at Howard's Park picking up pine needles all the time. Like I'm the crazy lady who's picking up all the pine needles because I've started making pine needle baskets. And but people are like, oh, you can't use pine needles, you can't use pine stuff because it'll acidify your soil. That's not true. In fact, it's the plants themselves that acidify the soil. It's not their needles, it's not their pine cones. So that's a great idea. I may actually use that. I'm going to go to Howard's Park and pick up tons of pine cones.
It lightens your pots too.
Yeah.
It doesn't make them so hot. Yeah, I find it works wonders for mine.
Or fabric cloth, like I hate fabric cloth, but it has its uses. If you're worried about soil going through those drainage holes, you can put down just a little piece of burlap or fabric cloth at the bottom and it'll still drain great.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Gwen, do you have another question?
Well, it's a caveat to what Marilyn is saying, because I loved that idea last year, Marilyn. So I tried it, but I don't have as many pine trees as you. In fact, I have only one. But so I put one pot, I put like the pine cones and everything. And then another one, I put, the containers you bring home from the garden center. Mettons, you got like you bought 6 plants. Well, sometimes they'll give you a little tray to put them in. So then I cut those in half and I put those in the bottom to take up space. But unfortunately, I had these, is it Kana or Kala lilies that were so super productive that they grew like about 6 foot tall, and then the pots were too light. Yeah. So, some I would put stones in, but I hadn't thought about it with these, and they were forever falling over. So, it's like you've got to choose your battle, I think, with those things. But yeah. I like the idea of the organic stuff to fill up the pot, to not always use like your good potting compost for that. So that's a caveat. Make sure your pots are heavy enough to hold up plants that go crazy.
Well, one of the things we're going to look at later is one of the reasons that I use grow bags, or one of the reasons I really like grow bags, is I'm actually growing my own potting medium as I'm growing my vegetables. So I'll discuss that in a little bit, but it's a way for me to save on peat and potting mix, because I'll discuss it in a little bit, but when I discovered this, it changed my world and it saved me so much money that this year, considering like I started by spending like several $100s just to fill up my bed. This year I have to spend on nothing but a little bit of shrimp compost. So maybe $50. I'm saving a lot of money. One of the things though, is if you think your plant is diseased, don't reuse it. If you've got like blight or something, or a really bad fungal disease, you could hot compost it, but I wouldn't use it again. I wouldn't repurpose it. And or if you have like a lot of bugs, just compost them, or hot compost them. Hot composting is like cooking everything. I love it. We'll go quickly through different types of, I'm just going to minimize this. Hold on a second. Quickly through different types of containers. It's really important that you choose the right containers. The pros of glazed or sealed ceramic is that they're pretty. Who doesn't love them? I mean, I have to stop myself from buying them. There's just so many gorgeous pieces of pottery out there, and they're heavy and they don't blow over. And that's one reason people really like them too, is you don't have to worry about them blowing over so much. They can mask ugly plastic containers. And they're good for underwatering using a saucer, or if you put that plastic container inside one that doesn't have a drainage hole, it's a great way to underwater certain types of plants. There are some cons. They're pricey. I mean, the bigger they are, the pricier they're going to get. They're really heavy and fragile. And I have broken many a nice pot. And it breaks my heart every time I do. They don't overwinter well, especially in our climate with extremes of heat and cold. They will eventually weaken. They often only have one drainage hole. and it's a problem. Like, I think half the reason people struggle with containers is they only come with one drainage hole. And you want to have more drainage than just one hole in the center, right? And sometimes they don't come with drainage holes at all. So stick that plastic container in. And the biggest problem with these is they retain heat, especially if they're a darker color, they're right in full sun. They will literally cook your roots. They will just evaporate. And so they're really wonderful if you put them in a shadier area. They're really great on a deck where you've got, shade, but I find that in full sun, you're really pushing it, especially with a dark glazed ceramic container. The other one that we know is unglazed containers. All of these ceramics are made from clay, and terracotta is your classic unglazed ceramic. They're earthy. I like them. They don't overheat as much as like dark glazed. People use them in very hot climates like Mexico and southern United States. Again, they're heavy, they don't blow over. And one of the good things about them, which is why they're great for cacti and succulents and stuff, is that they wick moisture. They're porous, right? So moisture will actually go right through that clay and evaporate. So for plants that don't like really wet soil, they're fantastic. The cons are, again, they're heavy and fragile and hard to move and store. They don't overwinter well. They water stain. Personally, I don't care about the water stains. I think they look a little more rustic that way, but some people prefer them to look more new. Again, 1 or 0 drainage holes sometimes. And a con as well is that they wick moisture. So they're awful for plants that need to maintain moisture. So as much as I love them, I don't use terracotta a whole lot because my plants need moisture. I grow mainly vegetables. By far the most popular type of container is going to be made out of plastic, not just plastic pots, right? Or plastic nursery pots. Basically anything that's plastic can kind of be turned into a container, right? So you've got lots of choices. You've got lots of do-it-yourself options. I love this because he used like a storage bin, or she, and then put in an irrigation system, like drilled a hole and stuck in this hose connection. So they have a little irrigation system, and they've put it up here so that it drains really well. They're pretty inexpensive. Plastic's inexpensive. You can reclaim plastic. They're less prone to overheat. They're easy to clean. Gosh, they're easy to clean. They're so easy to store. And if you don't have enough drainage holes, you can just make more. You can drill them and sometimes even punch them. And that's one of the reasons I really like plastic, is I can really control my drainage holes. I can make my own. And they're light. They're lighter than ceramic, right? The cons are they can discolor. They can appear cheap and utilitarian. And the big one, they can be toxic. Okay, if they're not food grade, you shouldn't be using them to grow food. For flowers, it's not going to hurt your plants. But if you're growing food, stay away from non-food grade plastics. What does that mean? Stay away from number 3s and number 6s. All right, these are the 2 numbers. When you look at plastic, you're always going to see one of these numbers, right? And 3 and 6 are the evil numbers. This is styrofoam. So never grow anything in styrofoam, just awful. And this is PVC. And I'm sometimes shocked at how many people make hydroponic systems using PVC or have PVC in the actual gardens or in the soil. I would never use PVC in a gardening scenario. All other plastics, these are your typical, water bottles and such. This is like milk jugs. Polypropylene is more like, the plastic you use for chemicals and hair products. And LDPE is like plastic bags, like sometimes like for your pet bags. They're sometimes recyclable, sometimes they're not. In Sherbrooke, I can't recycle these. So like plastic pet bags, I can. And number 7s are, those big water jugs. So stay away from 6s and 3s and you're fine. I actually like plastic for a lot of things. These are potatoes. Right? Now, I've grown potatoes, and I will tell you the thing that drives me crazy about potatoes is voles. Voles often get into them, and all my potato crop gets eaten up by voles. voles would have a hard time getting up here. So this person's drilled a lot of holes. There's potatoes growing out. And I think this is a great way. These Rubbermaid bins are food grade. You'd put about this much soil in here, and you put in your seed potatoes. And then you can just keep topping it up. That's how you grow potatoes, right? You could top it up with hay and some manure and keep adding hay and manure until they keep growing up. And then you just dump out your potatoes at the end of the season. I love this idea. I'm probably going to do this year. This is a garden in New York City where they've used milk crates. Milk crates can sometimes be found pretty cheap. New, they're about $10 each. Milk crates are great for putting, containers on to drain. They look kind of weird, but they're useful. And they're fantastic for things like lettuce and strawberries and dwarf tomatoes and lots of herbs and greenery. Not great for larger tomato plants and cucumbers just because they don't have the volume, but they drain great. And often they just stick like a bit of fabric cloth or burlap inside to keep it from spilling out. So this is an entire garden made out of milk crates. I've done this. So those big Rubbermaid bins, again, food grade plastic, can hold about 2 good tomato plants. And they are pretty inexpensive. You can even get them secondhand. And I've used them on balconies because I've used the tops to catch the water underneath. I've drilled lots of holes and I've caught the water in the lids that I've put underneath so it doesn't spill into my neighbor's balcony. And these grow as well. Tomatoes will grow as well in these as they would in, say, like a straw bale or a couple of 10-gallon bags. So I really like Rubbermaid bins. They don't look great, but they work. There are those plastic large water containers. Again, not the prettiest things in the world, but if you're really into do-it-yourself, this is another thing that you can use. I probably would have just made like little open flaps and be able to close them to make little greenhouses, but that's just me. This buckets, 5-gallon buckets are fantastic. There's a system that you can find online where you double them up and again, this guy's using PVC. I'm not sure I would do that. You can find other types of plastic pipings for a simplified watering system. So it's an automatic watering system, and these are cucumbers, right? And they're growing up really well on this. Remember that, I think it was a number 4 plastic, which is the plastic bags. Well, that's what your soil comes in. And so why wouldn't you do this, right? And this is fun to do with the kids, because they think it's kind of nifty that you just have to, cut a hole into a bag, pop a couple of drainage holes with a screwdriver on the bottom, and you've got, a nifty little container for things like greens and lettuces and mustards and even, and herbs. Wood's very popular. You've probably seen them all over Facebook Marketplace, people selling wood containers. Wood's nice, you can have all kinds of styles, you can make them to measure, you can do it yourself if you like to construct, something I like to get more into. You can reclaim wood, you can repurpose wood. You don't have to worry about things overheating with wood. They winter pretty well if they're made from the type of wood that can handle, weathering, like cedar or redwood or heat treated wood. The cons are that natural wood, like if you used pine or other natural woods that aren't like cedar or redwood, they will degrade with time, so they're shorter lived and they'll look weathered. The really good woods like cedar and redwood and hardwood is very expensive, and more so these days than ever before. Often a plastic liner is recommended, just helps with rotting. And you want to avoid pressure treated, painted, stained, and reclaimed wood because they're often toxic. I've seen a lot of people making containers out of pallets. You have to be really careful with pallets. Don't be confused. Heat treated and pressure treated are 2 different things. Heat treated, they use heat that helps to dry out the wood so that, it doesn't rot as easier. But pressure treated literally means that they inject chemicals into the wood and they use pressure to inject that chemical into the wood. And those chemicals are often really bad for you. Less so now that they took arsenic out of the recipe. So about 20 years ago or so, they took arsenic. So anything that's like pretty old is definitely toxic. Galvanized steel is one of my favorite ways to container garden, especially if you want to do pretty things like little herb gardens and flower gardens. They look nice. They don't heat up too much. They're not expensive. They winter really well, and they are safe. A lot of people will tell you that galvanized steel is not safe, that it's going to leach things like zinc into your soil, and that's bad. Well, that's not true. It will leach a little bit of zinc into your soil, but zinc's actually good for your plant, and it's good for you, and it's never going to be in a quantity that is unsafe. It becomes unsafe if you make pickles in galvanized steel, because it's acidity that actually leaches zinc from galvanized steel the most. And we use galvanized steel to feed animals with troughs. We use it for milking. It's safe, so don't worry about the zinc leaching. Just don't make pickles in it. Don't add vinegar to them. You do need to drill or punch holes. You want to avoid rusty or painted containers for edibles, for obvious reasons. And the second to last type of container garden that I'm a big fan of is the straw bale garden. Most people are like, that's not a container, that's a straw bale. Well, again, it's the same principle. We're limiting the space of where the plant can grow, okay? And we do have to provide a lot more water and fertilization to a straw bale, just like we would to anything that was in, say, a pot. So it is contained. So it's a form of container gardening for a lot of us. They're really cheap. They between like $5 and $8. They make great compost or filler for raised beds, full of fungal mycelium. It's a great way if you're thinking of making raised beds. Try having a few straw bale gardening projects, and it'll help cut the cost of having to fill those. They can go anywhere pretty much except a balcony. The cons, they're kind of unsightly. They're not the prettiest things. There's a lot of preparation to get them ready for planting. They can stain your pathways and concrete in your decks, and they require a lot of water and fertilization. And just for fun, I wanted to share how I got kind of annoyed of having a balcony. I container gardened with straw bales. A friend of mine who lived about 5 kilometers away, a family friend, said, I have an old barn. It's bedrock. Could you do something with that? And I'm like, I could straw bale garden, rather than buy soil or build raised beds, because it wasn't my property and it was for sale. So I didn't want to invest. We transformed this concrete-like area into this. So that was probably around the end of June. So straw bale gardening kind of gets a bad rap for being ugly. And yes, this was very makeshift, but this became our oasis, and it is a form of container gardening, and I highly recommend it, especially if you have bedrock or concrete. Unfortunately, this actually got taken out by a tornado a few years later. So I'm glad I didn't invest in raised beds. There's lots of things you can use for containers. An old bathtub would be great for flowers. I'm not sure I'd grow food. I'm not sure how well this tree will do in there, but you could make a flower bed out of this. Those plastic bins that you put all your kids' toys in or you use for your laundry and stuff are great for growing greens. They're deep enough. I've seen really cool things done with galvanized steel gutters. I liked how this person's using the water from their little greenhouse to actually water these greens here. I've seen people use tires. Please don't use them for edibles. It's one of those really toxic environments for edibles. Fine for flowers, really cute for the kids, but do not use tires to grow any kind of vegetables or any type of edibles.
Tanya?
Yeah.
Martin avait une question. Martin,
Oh,
veux-tu poser ta question?
Ouais, ce que tu fais dans la paille, tu sèmes directement dans la paille? Ou
Moi,
tu
j'aimerais
réduis le
ça
médium?
donner. Ouais, ben, c'est un processus où tu utilises un engrais avec beaucoup de nitrogène. So you use nitrogen fertilizer, usually like a urea-based fertilizer. Tu commences le compostage. So you compost the bins. It's a long process. I could give a workshop. Je pourrais donner un atelier sur ça. And basically, you bring the temperature to about 140, 50 degrees. Ça veut dire tu fais du hot composting. Tu fais du compostage chaud, là. Ça vient à 150, là. Puis après ça, tu mets du engrais, you add some fertilizer, and tu vas voir, là, c'est super raide quand tu commences. It's super hard when you start with your bale. Après 3 semaines, after 3 weeks, tu es capable de mettre ta main dedans.
Ah.
And so you actually like, tu tires ça, puis tu mets tes plantes dedans. You put your plants in.
OK.
I'll show you more pictures. Je vais te montrer d'autres photos, mais c'est un autre atelier, puis ça serait un atelier peut-être 20 minutes. C'est pas long.
OK.
On pourrait faire ça.
OK, merci.
Ou on peut, we could zoom ourselves, on peut zoomer entre nous deux, puis je peux te donner toutes les instructions si tu veux.
OK.
OK.
Merci.
Some people go a little crazy with container gardening.
Tanya, Denis Thibodeau.
Yeah,
as-tu une
but,
question,
but
Denis?
don't you think that straw bale are a very poor medium to grow plants?
They're not the best medium to grow
Uh,
plants. They're good for, I tell you, the best things that grow in straw bales for me has been tomatoes. And even if I had land, I would still probably straw bale somewhat in tomatoes. Peppers don't like them. They're not great for root crops. They're not really good for carrots and beets. Maybe the second, you use a lot of fertilizer.
Yeah.
That's the
Let's,
problem.
yeah. I think that it should need a lot of attention.
It does. And it needs a lot of watering.
Yeah, yeah, because yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's possible, but it should. Yeah, it takes a lot of care, I'm sure.
It does. It's a lot of care, and we often recommend that you use soaker hoses to keep them moist.
Mm,
I don't find them a fire hazard, except maybe the weeks when you're prepping it. Once they start to degrade, they're not really a fire hazard,
mm,
but it's not an ideal form to grow. But for
Mm.
somebody who has only a bit of concrete,
mm.
or like I had bedrock, and I was poor. I really didn't have money. So 36 bales cost me about $120.
What talking about straw bales? Wouldn't it be a good choice for mulch?
I used the straw bales for mulch as well in the second year. So I still have I gave most of my straw bales away to a neighbor to compost because I have too much compost, right? So I kept my straw bales to use as mulch for this year. And they're already full of beautiful mushroom spores and mycelium. So yeah, I will be using that, but I'm mixing it with cedar because the one thing I find I've had when I only went to straw for mulch is I got a lot more flea beetles.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe it doesn't last long as well. I don't know.
It lasts really long.
It lasts long, yeah?
Yeah, it's surprising how it depends also on the straw. Switchgrass straw won't last as long as say.
Oh, there are different types.
Yes, and you won't get wheat straw here, but you'll get oat straw. And wheat straw you don't want because how do they kill wheat? They poison it, right? But oat straw doesn't have to be killed that way, and switchgrass doesn't either. And switchgrass is less dense. But I think that would be the subject of maybe a future a workshop. But yeah, there's different kinds of straw, and don't use hay. Hay is a bad idea because hay is just so full of like nitrogen, it will grow a lot of weeds.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not aware of that. Okay.
But I would like to mention the biggest, yes, another question?
We do have another question before we go on. I think Carol.
I'm
has
almost
some-
done too.
This is fantastic as a presentation. Can you go back 2 slides and explain how we can grow in boots?
Oh, I mean, basically drill some holes in the bottom. Drill some holes, get the drill out, drill a few holes. I've seen people do like whole boot, like I've seen people fill jeans with soil and make like little bottoms of people, kind of like the, you know, that Dr. Seuss character of the pants that walk around, you know, without a person in them, and fill them up and put flowers spilling out of them. Anything that can hold soil can grow a plant as long as it drains, right? So just drill some holes into those old boots. Don't grow lettuce in there. That's all I'm saying. Just put some petunias or something, but don't grow anything edible, right?
Great.
Teapots are so cute with flowers coming out of them. Love that.
Okay, so for the rest of the questions, you can continue, Tanya, then we'll have another question session.
Because I really want to push grow bags. I really want to push grow
There we go.
bags. They came out about 5 or 6 years ago, and grow bags changed everything. First of all, they're super cheap. I mean, they're not super cheap. You can get like $25, $30, you'll get about 5, but you'll get a big enough container. And one of the biggest problems of getting containers is getting them big enough, right? So people will say, oh, grow your tomato in a 5-gallon bucket. I've grown in a 5-gallon bucket, and I've grown in a 10-gallon and 15-gallon grow bag. And I will tell you, you will get twice as big a tomato plant that's twice as big in a grow bag, and a grow bag will cost you $5. They don't heat up. They're light. They're basically a woven fabric, right? They're felt is what they are. So it's super light. They fold up. They have little handles on them. They winter well. I leave mine out all winter for my tomatoes. I don't get any mold on them. I don't have to move them. They drain really well because they're completely porous, right? So they drain really, really well. But most of all, they promote root hair growth as opposed to root bound. And I'll get back to this in a second. There are just a couple of cons to them. They are hard to clean. They can get mossy, they can get mineral stained. Eventually they'll need to be replaced, but they'll last for years. And they can dry out a little faster, right? Because they're completely porous all the way around, but mulching really helps. You will have to water a bit more with these, but it's well worth it. Because here's the difference. Look at the root bound pot. We've all experienced this, right? We've all taken a plant out of a pot and it's just this big tangle of roots and we're playing with it. This is the difference, because this is called air pruning. Think of these large roots, these tap roots that plants put out as the arms. You're at a party. There's the party mix, right? That you want to eat. You want to get the pretzels. You move your arms out to go reach for the pretzels in the party mix. And then you use your fingers to actually get the food and put it in your mouth. So these are the arms, these large roots. What happens is in a regular container, those big arm roots that I call them come out to the side of the container and they're still looking for food. And so they start going in a circle and going in a circle. I think someone has their mic on. That's fine. But here, when it reaches the edge of a fabric grow bag, it says, oh, this is the limit of where my arms can go. I'm gonna make lots and lots of fingers to get food and water. So it starts making root hairs, those teeny tiny hairs. These big roots don't bring up nutrients. Those little tiny root hairs do. Right? And the more root hairs you have, the more efficient your plant is going to be at growing. And the less diseased it will get too. Here's another example. This is actually a tree that was grown in a regular pot, right? Look at all those big roots. If you've had to plant a tree like this, you have to cut those roots, and it's kind of shocking to have to do it. There's not a lot of root hair action. They will actually start to strangle out the plant completely. Here is a grow bag. You don't see any of those big roots. You see it stopped. And now all this white stuff is mycelium growing with little tiny root hairs. So when I said that I grow my own medium for my pots and I repurpose it, it's those root hairs. Rather than adding peat every year, those root hairs now become my peat, so to speak, right? And they're full of nutrients. So I just keep them in my pots, stir them up, add some compost, or I take it out and you'll see the difference. You pull one of these out of a pot and you're going to be wrenching with the roots. It'll come out one big lump and there's not much you can do with it. When you have a grow bag, you will pull up on a stem of, say, a huge tomato plant, and you'll get a ball of stuff like this, of big roots, and the rest, absolutely light and fluffy, ready to be used for next year. So I save money by using grow bags, by making my own potting medium. And they are they're not the prettiest containers, all right? But I kind of mask them. This is where I put my straw bales. I grew nasturtiums in the sides of my straw bales. They went a little nuts to kind of mask how ugly they were. I'm in the North Ward of Sherbrooke, and I'm sure the neighbors would have been, they did think I was crazy with all my straw bales until they saw the nasturtiums. They're like, oh, c'est tellement joli, on aime ça. But I use grow bags all along and all in the back. And I don't have issues. I don't even move these in the wintertime. They're covered in snow. It's fine. I don't care if they leach. There's nothing to them by the end of the summer, right? And these are fun because they have flaps. And so if you grow carrots and stuff with like kids, you can look at them growing. You can kind of open them up and check out how they're growing. I even use grow bags for seedlings for the same reason. I'm promoting root hair growth, not root bound. They're a pain to fill, but they're super inexpensive. And if you're not growing 200 tomato plants like I did one year in these things, they're well worth it because I get better plants growing in these little seedling bags. If you're choosing a container, design, what do you want to do? What kind of gardening do you do? How does it fit into your landscape? Are you utilitarian like I am, or do you like pizzazz? The specific plant needs, like if your plant is something that, the type of plant that's going to grow like 10 feet deep, probably not going to do well in a container, right? But it might do well in like a really deep 2-foot deep container, like a wood box. The spread and the moisture that it needs, where you're going to put that container. Don't put your latest plastic containers in the middle of a windy tunnel area of your land, something heavier. Safety is a big one. So edibles or not. That's my cat playing. Size. Always aim for more, not less volume. Again, grow bags, you can go from 1 gallons right up to 20 gallons. Some are bigger. You can get like 200-gallon ones, but you don't need that. 20 gallons is more than enough, right? I use 15 gallons for tomatoes. You could get away with 10, but I use 15. Did I mention size? Go big. The bigger, the better. And storage and overwintering. So if you don't have a place to stick all your containers, it can be a bit of a problem. But one of the biggest consideration is the price of your containers for me, because, money is a factor in how I garden and how much it's going to cost me to fill them. The first year, like any garden, you're going to invest the most. And I, again, promote grow bags because I've literally saved myself probably about $200 worth of potting mix every year by just using grow bags. Maximizing yields, we're almost done. Maximizing yields. So for me, because I have such a small area with sun, I really have to maximize how much I can grow in an area. I use fast growing crops. So I like radishes. I don't like raw radishes, but I love cooked radishes. So I grow a lot of radishes. I grow a lot of lettuce, grow peas. I do succession planting. So, I'll plant out and then I'll put in a new container, and I interplant as well. There's no reason why you can't stick a tomato, some lettuces, in between the backs of some tomato plants where they get some shade. You can interplant in containers as well. Just remember, you want shallow rooted plants with any deeper rooted plants, but don't put too many. I overplant carrots and beets and turnips, and I pick them out at the baby stage and thin them out. I do multi-use crops a lot, and one of my favorite ones is radishes. So I eat radish leaves, I make pesto out of it, I eat the radishes, but I also let the radishes go to seed and create radish pods, and they're absolutely delicious. And if I had to start a business, I would just grow radish pods because they're just so yummy. Greens that don't quit, like lettuce and chard and kale, is a great way to, you know, get the most out of your space, out of your garden. Fruiting veg that don't quit, like summer squash, cucumbers, and cucamelons. Oh my gosh, don't grow too many cucamelons. Like 3 plants, you'll have more cucamelons and you'll never want to eat a cucamelon again. And I really wish that I could grow more flowers because I love flowers. And I believe in pollinator gardens. I really do. My neighborhood has no wildflowers and very few flowers that the bees like. We had nothing but ants here, and yellow jackets. In 2 years, we have more species of predatory wasps, bumblebees, honeybees that we've never seen before, butterflies, because I grow flowers, but I grow mainly edible flowers, so that I maximize my space for growing. And herbs also give edible flowers. So I grow nasturtiums, bachelor's buttons, calendula. I also grow, you know, basil flowers, thyme flowers, mint flowers, lemon balm flowers. So any of those things. And I use some season extension and protection. And real quick, I'll talk about that. Another way to maximize yield. Another way to maximize your space, like I said, I use these bales here where it was too hot to grow with grow bags. Building trellis systems, say you're doing peas or beans. Bamboo poles are fantastic. They're cheap. They're easy to lash together with mason twine. Cages, I like cages, but I always connect them with bamboo poles to keep them upright. I make teepees using these bamboo poles. Again, you can use that for tomatoes, beans, anything. You just nestle them right inside your container. And I like grow bags because I can tie them off to these handles. Use what you have. How many people have fences and never do anything with them? I love fences. You could do all kinds of cool things with fences. You know, these are container gardens, hanging baskets, and these is just gutters, right? Those are safe. Build height. Nestle your pots on top of each other. All you need is a wooden dowel. Goes right through each drainage hole. And then you have more height. You could use this even for some herbs. Make it whimsical. Same thing. It's a dowel, but a little more whimsical. You can buy these things. I've had those. They work. Again, you put a dowel through the center, often helps to keep it stabilized. And you can even container garden upside down. I've seen people do it. I don't know why they do it, but they do. I don't get the point of growing upside down, but if you're looking at protecting your plants, I highly recommend these. They're not expensive. I got mine on Amazon for about $76. They come in different sizes. It's basically a mini greenhouse. I keep it down with some large stones and they roll up. So this can act as an unheated greenhouse in the spring. So you can extend your season using these and put your grow bags inside. There are some that are tents, like pop-up tents, and they're fine too. But these are will get surprisingly hot. I like these with the metal bars because I can put insect netting over them. To protect a lot of my plants from Japanese beetles and flea beetles, although flea beetles sometimes still get in, and cabbage moths and stuff. So I'll put insect netting over these and just clip them with utility clips from the dollar store. And they're great for shade cloth. So, you know, sometimes our vegetables get too hot, I'll put shade cloth over these. So I take off the plastic. These little hoops, you know, everybody has these little hoop tunnels in their gardens. I love hoop tunnels. You can do them if you have like large containers like grow bags. You can get these from the dollar store. They're like 6 for like $4.50 now. and they're the perfect width to nestle in. And I just connect them with a bamboo pole, and then I put insect netting. I can put greenhouse plastic or shade cloth. And if you double them up and have, for example, if you had a bunch of grow bags in here, you could put those hoop things or one of those little mini greenhouses and maybe put some floating row cover on it, and you could grow in the winter time. I actually have one of these. It became my chicken run, but now my chickens are gone because I wanted more growing space, and 2 chickens were just too much work for too few eggs. Yes.
Hi, Tanya. So it's getting on to 8:20.
I'm almost done.
wondering, yeah, if we have some, I want to have some time for some questions.
I'm just going to talk about watering, and that's it. Watering and fertilization, and I'm done. Containers always dry out really fast, so you have to baby them. You can mulch. Remember, mulch, mulch, mulch. Drip irrigation is an option. With grow bags, I do use soaker hoses. Water bottles buried inside containers can help. With containers, always water in the morning and water super, super deeply. The biggest mistake people make is they don't water the containers enough. And in hot weather, you're going to have to probably water twice. Fertilizing, they leach. That's the biggest problem as well. Water and fertilization, they will lose their ability to retain moisture and nutrients. Rain will definitely also leach out nutrients. Use a slow release fertilizer. Compost isn't enough. And heavy feeders like tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplants, they needed added calcium and magnesium. And I really recommend for containers that you use something called CalMag, which is a liquid fertilizer just for calcium and magnesium. Just enjoy your garden with your family and neighbors. That's my kid. He grew an eggplant for the first time. He was so excited to have an eggplant, hated the eggplant when he had to eat it. But we pickled vegetables, so he's learning about pickling. These are some of the things that I've grown in my garden. So if people say you can't grow big tomatoes in containers, I beg to disagree. I grow a lot of tomatoes. I also roast and preserve a lot of tomatoes. I make all my tomato sauce for the winter in containers. I make tarts out of tomatoes. And I make a lot of salads. And I just wanted to show you, you know, except for the grapes, okay, and the apricots, these are barrage flowers. These are bachelor's button. These are all edible flowers. These are nasturtiums, and everything else is from my garden. This takes 5 minutes to make. Get edible flowers. I highly recommend you do that. And that's pretty much it. Sorry, I really was verbal diarrhea. Because
No, it's super, super interesting. Do you want to stop sharing your screen, and we can go back?
Gosh, yes.
Go back into.
It's past my bedtime.
Oh no, that was really super, super interesting. Pour les francophones, pour les fleurs, je sais pas, bachelor's button, c'est la centaurée et la bourrache. Borage flowers there, si vous cherchez le nom. Je vais arrêter l'enregistrement. I'm going to stop the